In this episode, U Lethbridge music professor Dr. Emily Gale discusses Sentimental Songs for Sentimental People. Our sense of feeling remains critical to how and why we engage with popular music. A deep dive into sentimental pop music, however, reveals persistent judgment and suspicion. Looking at the history of the most popular English-language songs of the last 250 years, we uncover clues about the socio-political circumstances and the cultures in which popular music is made and enjoyed. Join Dr. Gale as we listen beyond a straightforward account of embarrassing guilty pleasures and reveal the unexpected histories of sentimental songs and why we should take these feelings seriously.
Okay, and good evening, people of feeling. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am delighted to be here at the Owl in Lethbridge on the traditional territory of the Sentimental People to share some of my current research with you. So tonight I will be presenting material from my book in progress, as Heather just said. It is titled Sentimental Songs for Sentimental People, An Unheard History of U.S. Popular Music. This is a project that traverses 250 years of pop song, in which I'm proposing 5 chapters that each address some thematic aspect of sentimentality in Anglo-American popular music: home, love, tears, death, and youth. This evening, I'll first offer a brief overview of the project, and then I'll dive into 2 case studies along with their unexpected political histories. I'll consider what an 1855 sentimental song sheet reveals about gender and race in antebellum culture, and how a 1960s sing-along television show informed notions of belonging and American citizenship during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. So grab your tissues and let's get into our feelings. In 1996, Reader's Digest published a box set titled Sentimental Songs That Will Live Forever. The compilation was released in the US and Canada on CD and cassette tape. 84 tracks comprise the collection, and on the back cover, these have been subdivided into the following categories: sentimental choruses, sentimental piano and orchestra, sentimental strings, sentimental orchestras, sentimental groups, sentimental gals, sentimental guys, and sentimental combos. I once joked that I would never run out of material on a project on sentimental songs, so here I am analyzing the contents of a Reader's Digest box set. It is not the only one of its kind in my collection. The compilation's cover shows a stylized drawing of a man and a woman. Both are white with blonde hair, and both sport collared shirts beneath pastel-colored bomber jackets. The woman leans over the man, her arms wrap around him, and her hands clasp against his chest. They smile affectionately as they nearly touch, nose to nose. Renderings of fluffy green grass and lavender flowers surround the pair. Here in this fantasy field, pun intended, of white, preppy, heteropatriarchal love, sentimental songs will live forever. But what is a sentimental song, and where did this idea come from? And how has it changed over time? These are the questions that have informed my research, and I have been very influenced by feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, who talks about the idea of following an idea around. And so the way that I think about this is that for the last 12 years, I have been following sentimental songs around. I have traced where this idea appears, often as a brand on the cover of old sheet music, in playlist titles, and on album covers. And I'm especially interested in how people talk about sentimentality in relationship to pop music. I'm thinking about tuning a feminist ear to the history of sentimental songs in order to attend to questions of whose feelings are sounded, whose feelings are heard, and whose are silenced altogether. My own relationship to this material is personal. As a kid, my dad sang in an 80-man barbershop chorus. On weekends, my brother and I would visit our dad and attend the chorus's rehearsals with him. We would sit in front of this massive chorus who sang a broad collection of sentimental songs in 4-part harmony. Feeling remains critical to how and why most listeners engage with popular song, but this is a repertory that has largely been overlooked within music studies and often denigrated in public discourse. A deep dive into sentimental pop history reveals persistent judgments and suspicion, overly emotional, pathetic, mawkish, cloying. These are just a few of the adjectives that surface when tuning into this history of the most popular English language songs of the last 250 years. So this talk is going to listen beyond a straightforward account of embarrassing guilty pleasures to reveal some of these unexpected political histories of sentimental songs and why we should take these sounded feelings seriously. So I'm just going to spend a few moments going over some of the historical and theoretical framework that I'm working with here. There's a lot of overlap there's been a ton of ink that has been spilled on the topic of sentimentality in general, and so I'm interested in how that relates to this idea of composers and musicians writing through this idea and branding things as a sentimental song. So most accounts of sentimentality, whether they're musical, literary, philosophical, or otherwise, reiterate a similar story. They narrate the decline of sentimentality in status from the 18th century through to the present. For moral sentiment theorists in the 18th century, sentimentality was thought of as a positive attribute and a powerful tool. As literary scholar Janet Todd has argued, sentimental works aim to inspire feelings of sympathy in the viewer. They demand an emotional or physical response, often describing the bodily processes of emotion, including references to tears, sighs, and hearts. Sentimental works are also thought to be didactic. They're meant to teach. So the arousal of feeling was meant to be instructive, to teach people how to feel, ennobling benevolence among humans, and illustrating decent responses to life experiences. Sentimental works also make use of stock characters and situations. They identify compassionately with characters of low social or socioeconomic standing, as well as minorities, including older people, enslaved people, children, animals, and women, and they treat everyday commonplace issues. The later texts on sentimentality tend to describe it negatively as an indulgence in superficial emotion. Many sentimental works have experienced vast popularity, and as such, they are often aligned or even maligned with concepts such as mass culture and commercialism, domesticity, and femininity. In their introduction to their anthology, Sentimental Men, Masculinity and the Politics of Affect in American Culture, editors Mary Chapman and Glenn Hendler write that sentimentality and the public display of emotion are conventionally seen as feminine characteristics. Kathy Davidson and Jessamine Hatcher characterize this as the separate spheres ideology that dominated histories of the 19th century in American literature and in culture. Davidson and Hatcher write, quote, "Scholars have created a composite portrait of a 19th century United States where women were installed in female, domestic, sentimental, private spaces, basically the world of the home, and men in the individualistic public sphere of commerce, politics, and reason," end quote. So in music studies, the term parlor song seems to have kind of semantically fixed popular 19th century songs within the space of the white middle-class domestic sphere. Parlor song is often the term that is used synonymously to describe some of these older sentimental songs. Musicologists writing about this have all discussed the figure of the piano girl, emphasizing gendered accomplishments and describing the practice of collecting parlor songs in binders volumes. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples here that illustrate how this understanding factored into pop music production and specifically the feminized image of sentimental songs. On your left there, I've got the cover of the sentimental waltz ballad, "Are You Thinking of Me Tonight?" from 1927. And this shows a pale white woman sitting beneath a tree, gazing longingly off into the distance. So you'll note there that the subtitle, it's very carefully marking this as a sentimental waltz ballad. On the right, I've got the cover from Henry DeMarson's new comic and sentimental singer's journal. And here we see this was a periodical that was produced in a series, and at the center, every time we see a young woman seated at a keyboard instrument with her parents behind her. So we see this idea, the gendered message is pretty clear. Sentimental songs, according to these materials, seem to live in the domain of women's musical culture. But this feminized image is by no means a constant in the history of music, and it did not emerge organically from women's participation in musical culture or the music industry. On the contrary, sentimental songs have all along been written, circulated, and performed by men as well as by women. The feminine associations of sentimental songs have less to do with their origins than with our changing attitudes about gender and emotional expression. So, there we go. My survey of collections that goes back to 1777. So I've surveyed a whole bunch of documents ranging from 1777 to 1848. And in this survey, I've located the emergence of the idea of the sentimental song as a distinct category of popular song in the United States in the second half of the 18th century. The very earliest references, printed references to sentimental song, appear on the title pages of 18th century songsters. So these were pocket-sized collections of printed lyrics of popular songs for the day. They didn't have any sheet or any notation in them. They were just the lyrics. Sometimes they would say, "Sing this song to the tune of." So this is from my personal collection. This is an 1844 songster. And on the inside page there, you can see in very bold font the reference to sentimental songs being used to mark this as an important category. It's also got the correct Canadian spelling of parlor as well. Important to know. So songsters emerged during the height of British sentimentalism and the cult of sensibility and sentimentality that I've just spoken about. And so by the mid-18th century, they were published widely in Great Britain throughout the century. They end up crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they circulate widely throughout the eastern United States, and they end up importing this cult of sentiment along with them. Soon, publishers in the US adopted these print practices, and so in a comprehensive bibliography looking at songsters compiled by Irving Loewens, Loewens cites over 600 extant songsters that were published in the US between 1734 and 1821. And in this, he notes that the vast majority of these, 65%, in fact, were intended to be used, very much specified in the prefatory material by both men and women. And an additional 22% of them were addressed specifically and primarily to a male audience. So by the early 19th century, many US publishers began publishing single songs that they designated and sold as either sentimental songs or sentimental ballads. These terms were used very much interchangeably throughout the 19th century. These references to sentimental songs circulated amongst a literate public via newspapers, journals, sheet music, collections of song texts, advertisements, and concert reviews. And during this era, male musicians, songwriters, and publishers dominated the production of sentimental songs. So my first case study that I'll jump into in just a moment illustrates how one such songwriter spread the idea of the sentimental song. And these songs have a more complicated and overt political history than has often been acknowledged. In the early 1850s, the Philadelphia songwriter and savvy businessman Septimus Winner borrowed his mother's maiden name. Oops, there we go. Borrowed his mother's maiden name and began to publish sentimental ballads as Alice Hawthorne. His mother was apparently a distant cousin of American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne. Winner's choice to use a pseudonym was not uncommon, and many authors as well as composers published using an alias rather than their given names. However, the case of a man using a woman's pseudonym was both unusual and proved incredibly successful. Winner's biographer Michael Remsen writes that Winner's case is distinct in that he created an entire persona for Alice Hawthorne. So this is Alice Hawthorne, the fictional Alice Hawthorne on the cover of this sheet music here. He created this entire persona for Alice Hawthorne, and he consistently used this pseudonym for over 30 years. The Hawthorne ballads were among the most popular and successful of their day, and this is notable particularly because of their conspicuous absence from most accounts of 19th century popular music history and from US music history more generally. As a songwriter, Winter's Hawthorne ballads ended up outselling the compositions that he published under his own name by more than 6-to-1 in the first 7 years of the songwriter's career. In fact, the contemporaneous songwriter Matthias Keller went so far as to critique Winter's songs, comparing them to Hawthorne's, and suggesting that Winter might be more successful if he wrote more like Alice Hawthorne. An examination of Winter's compositional output suggests that the songwriter reserved his own name for the pages of instrumental works, marches, and other dances, as well as songs with political or military themes, and employed the Hawthorne name for the covers of songs that made home, family, and feelings the predominant themes. In other words, Hawthorne was the invented persona for Winter's sentimental songwriting voice, serving as a marketing device to separate the sentimental from the unsentimental. Between 1853 and 1888, Winter published over 100 songs under Alice Hawthorne's name. The first original song, How Sweet Are the Roses, was published in 1853. Hawthorne also receives credit for My Cottage Home, What is Home Without a Mother, which I've got pictured here for you, and Listen to the Mockingbird, which I will say more about in a moment. Winter's earliest popular songs, the Hawthorne songs, use the familiar tropes of sentimentality, referring directly to mother and child figures, to crying and to weeping, to the heart, and to interpersonal feelings of love and friendship, for children, for husbands, and for friends in need. In 1855, Winter published Listen to the Mockingbird using Alice Hawthorne's name. It was one of his earliest hits. And I think I got those slightly out of order. There we go. Okay. It was one of his earliest hits. Listen to the Mockingbird sold an astounding 20 million copies of sheet music in the ensuing 50 years. 15 million in the US and 5 million in Europe. In 1889, 34 years after its initial publication, several newspapers reported that the profits from the sale had exceeded $100,000. The song was particularly popular in the South, where the mockingbird was a common sight. Many new Southern mothers ended up naming their babies Hallie, after the song's protagonist. The song has endured throughout the 20th century, and like many other examples of 19th century popular music, it became a staple of the bluegrass and country repertory. So on Spotify alone, I counted almost 50 unique recordings of the song. There's a beautiful recent recording by Anonymous 4 with Bruce Molsky on banjo. Burl Ives recorded the song, and so did Louis Armstrong. It was parodied in the Flintstones, appearing as Listen to the Rocking Bird. And more recently, Barney the Big Purple Dinosaur adapted it with more appropriate lyrics for children. In the mid-19th century, long before the possibility of mechanical sound reproduction, the song was noted for its mobility and durability. By 1889, a North Carolina newspaper account stated, quote, "That very popular song, Listen to the Mockingbird, has been whistled, played, and sung until it has gained such widespread popularity that it has really earned a national reputation. It at once took the popular ear and has been ground out in every musical form and shape for a lifetime. Hand organs grind it out, and every new beginner on the piano is sure to include it in his simple repertory," end quote. So references to the song also appear in a number of newspapers, and there are some examples of a performance description of Listen to the Mockingbird in which the song was very enthusiastically applauded. These accounts serve to remind us that these sentimental songs were not simply relegated to the space of the parlor. These songs exceeded the boundaries of this particular space and dominated the 19th century US soundscape. Listen to the Mockingbird was performed by a multitude of unknown and amateur voices, voices that would have been raised in the service of expressing both individual and collective sentiments. Listen to the Mockingbird is the first song that Winter marketed as a sentimental ballad, and specifically, he markets it as a sentimental Ethiopian ballad. This is merging elements from the history of blackface minstrelsy, and the term was used to describe popular minstrel tunes such as Old Dan Tucker. It's very likely that this was used because the song would have been assimilated into the repertory of blackface minstrel troupes. A reference on the cover of the sheet music to Richard Milburn, who was a young African-American street musician. He also worked for Winter. This appears only on the first edition of the sheet music, and accounts of Milburn's involvement in the songwriting are contradictory at best. We aren't sure exactly what aspects he may have contributed to the song, but it is quite remarkable that his name was included at all on this particular cover. So this is a song. I've got a slightly different transcription here. This one is done for guitar, but the initial sheet music was written for singer with piano accompaniment, and the accompaniment relies on very simple harmonies, tonic, dominant, and subdominant chords. And like many popular songs of this era, the chorus is harmonized in 4-part. The melody uses a relatively narrow vocal range, and all of the verses are performed in first person, including the third verse, which begins with, "I feel like one forsaken." So I'm going to take a moment here, and I'm going to play a recording that I made a number of years ago of Listen to the Mockingbird. And I just want to make a little bit of a caveat about this particular recording. I am not a singer by training. I am a pianist. But I tend to practice and learn the songs that I write about, because I think it's really important to embody these songs and get a sense of relating to them as an amateur singer who has very little experience in accompanying themselves. And I also could not resist the opportunity to make a Mary Ford style harmony recording of myself. So that's what I'm going to just take a moment here, and we'll listen to the Mockingbird.
Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird, still singing where the weeping willows wave. Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird still singing over her grave. Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird, still singing where the weeping willows wave. Ah, well, I yet remember. Ah, well, I yet remember when we gathered in the cotton side by side. 'Twas in the mild September. 'Twas in the mild September, and the mockingbird was singing far and wide. Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird still singing o'er her grave. mockingbird. Listen to the mockingbird, still singing where the weeping willows wave. Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird. The mockingbird still singing o'er her grave. Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird, still singing where the weeping willows wave.
You're too kind. Okay, so in the chorus, the perspective switches as we are implored to listen. But why this imperative? Here, Winner as Hawthorne posits listening as a feminine activity, an activity that opens onto fully feeling the loss of Hallie. By using Hawthorne's voice, Winner advances the idea that women were more in tune with and more sensitive to nature. The willows remember Hallie. The mockingbird remembers her. It is Hawthorne who is sensitive to all, the willow, the bird, and the pain of the still grieving eye. Listen to the Mockingbird expresses loss, remembrance, and grief for the now dead female protagonist, Hallie. But whose voice are we hearing? Is the I of the song indeed a lover, as most commentators have suggested? If we hear the song from Hawthorne's perspective, then Winner's act of ventriloquism renders the expression homosocial, but is it homosexual? Or is it more open than that? The song seems to revel in ambiguity without ever revealing the details of the relationship. It's interpersonal, but not clearly romantic. One line in particular from the second verse suggests an alternate interpretation. It reads, "Ah, well, I yet remember from when we gathered in the cotton side by side." Using Southern imagery borrowed from Stephen Foster's plantation songs, we could consider the possibility that Listen to the Mockingbird was in fact imagined as an abolitionist song, a song that is participating in the movement to end chattel slavery. Like many musicians in the 1840s, Winner admitted to hearing and being influenced by the well-known Hutchinson family, a family of singers who toured the US and Europe, performing temperance and abolitionist songs. Gather in the Cotton side by side can be heard as in line with the other popular songs of the 1850s, like Foster's plantation songs, that were thought to recognize the public emotional lives of the enslaved. Using a minstrel song, commonly thought of as a tool of oppression, Winner invoices Hawthorne as a white Northern sympathizer for the anti-slavery cause. The mockingbird sings a soft sound that we have to be quiet in order to hear. Listening is a metaphor for emotional truth, either personal, empathetic, or spiritual. And it's not a coincidence that Winner would have Hawthorne bear that idea. While women authors were adopting male names in order to be taken seriously, Winner adopted a female pseudonym in order to be seen as more authentically unserious, popular, and compassionate. Since Hawthorne is a woman, we are to understand her as being always, to some extent, a sentimental stock character, and thus more authentic in understanding emotions such as those expressed in the songs. So it's tempting to want to claim the success of these Hawthorne ballads as a victory for women in the male-dominated sphere of antebellum music production. In one sense, Winner acknowledges the viability and the significance of a woman's culture and market. On the other hand, he affixed music in the home as the domain of the women's domestic sphere in an unprecedented way that has remained largely unquestioned since the 19th century. So by borrowing this female pseudonym, he participates in the gendering of sentimental songs as feminine, a process that disenfranchised women from constructing their own varied musical cultures and simultaneously alienated men from the emotional outlet of sentimentality. At the same time, he has a woman bear the political weight of advancing an anti-slavery agenda. Winner's efforts to feminize sentimental songs, however, did not mark the end of expressions of sentimentality in US mass culture. So the second case study that I'm going to skip to now is a particularly prominent example from mid-20th century television. In 1961, Mitch Miller retooled his popular sing-along album format and introduced it to a televisual audience. This hour-long variety show aired every other week on Friday nights between 9 and 10 on NBC. Miller, at this point, had already released 11 Sing-Along with Mitch LPs, of which Columbia Records had sold an astonishing 4.5 million units. This number included Sentimental Sing-Along with Mitch from 1960, an album featuring popular 19th century songs like Just a Wearyin' for You and Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, as well as Sentimental Fair from Tin Pan Alley. At this point in his career, Miller was well known. He had a history with sentimental novelty songs. As the A&R man for Columbia Records in the 1950s, Miller had raised the company's profile. He charted hit after hit for artists including Rosemary Clooney, Frankie Lane, Doris Day, and many others. On NBC's Sing Along with Mitch, Miller, joined by his all-male backup chorus, plays host and invites his audience to sing along by way of subtitles, while he, the sing-along gang, and special guests perform sentimental songs. In Sing Along with Mitch, Miller used sentimental songs not for mere emotional indulgence, but to engage in cultural nationalism and ideals of democracy. He capitalized on familiar songs, invigorating the sense of community and emotional unity endemic to older sentimental songs. Miller sparked renewed interest in sentimental singing and went on to participate in other projects that aligned singing with national identity, including the documentary film Keep America Singing from 1994. Miller used television, and specifically music on television, to create a participatory and emotional experience for mass American audiences that sought to unify and structure a sense of American identity against a backdrop of an imagined American musical past. So this is, these are from my personal collection as well. These are the song sheets that are included in, there are 4 copies in the albums, and they include the lyrics, again with the idea that listeners and people who are purchasing these really would have enacted some kind of participatory experience and really sung along with, Sing Along with Mitch. I have had this somewhat verified informally by some people who have told me that yes, indeed, they did sing along with the TV and with the albums. So, of course, just as a sense of belonging can include, it can also exclude. Miller's sounding of citizenship or belonging was somewhat of a limited enfranchisement. Seemingly unaffected by the racial unrest and shifting gender roles of the early 1960s, Sing Along with Mitch presented the nation nostalgically as overwhelmingly white and patriarchal, ultimately defining American citizenship rather narrowly. Mitch Miller predicated this sing-along enterprise on the basic idea that people like to sing together. The idea of an album that people could sing along to, Miller said in an interview, just kept nagging at me, and it seemed to strike a chord. Not only topping the Billboard charts, but also inspiring hundreds of imitations by popular recording artists of the time. An October 1960 issue of Billboard magazine proclaimed that 2.5 years after Miller's first recorded debut, the sing-along trend was still going strong, and that everyone was now in on the act. Everybody from Bing Crosby and Guy Lombardo to the Chipmunks have sliced sing-along packages. Sing-alongs are now available in Spanish, Yiddish, Italian, French, Polish, and German. There were also sing-along albums in the sacred, Latin American, kiddie, and even sports car field. Despite this craze for sing-alongs within their various guises, Miller's LPs, along with Tennessee Ernie Ford's hymn and spiritual packages, were the only recordings to make it into Billboard's top 100 album charts. So reviewers at the time connected Miller's enterprise to traditions of parlor song singing, thus emphasizing its specific form of sentimentality. Writing for the Washington Post in December of 1959, Eddie Gallagher Riley commented, Mitch Miller also found a theme in 1959 with seemingly endless variations. Sing Along with Mitch made its appearance in February and proved to be the greatest thing for amateur singing since the shower bath. Since then, there have been such additional volumes as More Sing Along, Still More Sing Along, Party Sing Along, Folk Song Sing Along, Fireside Sing Along, and Christmas Sing Along. I understand that Mitch is now considering a Sing Alone series for hermits. Of course, Miller did not actually release a Sing Alone series, but Gallagher's sardonic comment underscores the idea that singing along meant singing together. Singing along constructed community. So the show's title commands viewers to sing along. He used a theme song as well that both announced the show's intended purpose and asked the audience to voice their will to participate enthusiastically. I Love to Sing Along created a desire for this sing-along experience through the act of singing together. The title's imperative points to the suspicion or even assumption that by 1960 in the United States, amateur singing was a lost practice from a former era. A Time magazine critic from 1959 stated, Enrico Caruso and the phonograph drove the parlor tenor to the bathtub. Now Columbia Records' Mitch Miller is trying to lure him out from behind his shower curtain. In Miller's era, the widespread dissemination of recorded music and attendant high-fidelity culture, along with post-war car radio culture, would have been understood as similarly signaling or reinforcing the demise of amateur singing along and domestic music making. Somewhat ironically, Miller would recover this practice with another technological medium, the television. So I'm going to just play, I think this should work, a very short intro clip so that you get a feel of what this was like if you have not before seen or participated.
Please, don't just sit there. Come on and sing. 5 foot 2, eyes of blue. Well, what those 5 foot could do. Has anybody seen my gal? Turn up nose, turn down nose. Never had no other clothes. Has anybody seen my
Okay, we'll leave that there. On Sing Along with Mitch, Miller employed images, dialogue, and song repertory to explicitly brand his sing-along enterprise as sentimental. The pilot episode aired in the spring of 1960 as a special on Ford's Star Time and featured Mitch Miller as host, his sing-along gang of 25 male singers, and guest stars Leslie Uggams, Diana Trask, and the Brothers Four. The episode opens with a side portrait silhouette of Miller conducting the sing-along gang. Such a silhouette was also used in the show's closing credits. Though he is in shadow, Miller is recognizable because of his iconic pointed goatee. The shot purposefully seems to reference 19th century Victorian silhouette portraiture. Before the first words are spoken, the images express trade, nostalgia, and reminiscences over the past. Miller relied on similar visual cues for the cover of his Sentimental Sing-Along with Mitch LP and its subsequent songbook, both of which play on the typographical conventions of the 1890s or gay 90s font to prominently spell out the word sentimental. So through introductory monologues, Miller announced his sentimental ideas about song. Good evening, I'm Mitch Miller. Tonight we're going to enjoy a gift our parents found worth passing along, the songs that did for them what songs ought to do. They warmed the hearts of lovers, they made burdens seem light. They've moistened the eyes of those far from home. When we join voices for fun, these are still the songs we turn to. I hope before the hour is up, you'll feel the urge to add your voice to ours. And when you do, add it loud and clear. Miller's invitation lays bare his understanding of both song and singing. Songs have emotional work to do, and effective ones will be retained in collective memory. By Miller's account, the songs of 1960 do not successfully do their jobs of warming hearts, lightening burdens, and moistening eyes. They do not impact their receivers through emotional response. But the songs of a previous generation effectively do this kind of emotional work. Miller uses the possessive collective pronoun our to assume a shared history and invites the viewer into his worldview, which is invested in this musical past, whether it's actual or imagined. So the song selections are similarly sentimental. You get a sense from that from what I've just played. The majority of the repertory was published between the mid-19th century and the first 3 decades of the 20th century. The songs, although not specifically about being American, were written by American songwriters, and many of them are associated with barbershop singing. The enterprise itself sounds like a museum or a cabinet of American musical curiosity. He juxtaposes many songs, often in medley form, and seems to do so in the service of creating and selling a tradition. The sing-along enterprise doesn't look to a particular era from which to draw its past, but it's invested in a more kind of generalized pastness. So several of the songs were repeated across episodes and performed by more than one artist, illustrating the significance that Miller attached to them. The repetition of the song Heart of My Heart, for instance, offers a taste of the kind of sentimental fare served up on Sing Along with Mitch. Composed in 1926 by American songwriter Ben Ryan, Heart of My Heart played a significant role on the show and in the construction of sentimental singing. So this is a later kind of reunion show that Miller does, and there's a rendition here of Heart of My Heart. We'll just listen to a little bit of that.
Hey, don't just sit there. Come on and sing.
Okay, I'm going to leave that there for the sake of time. The rhyme of the title, The Gang That Sang, places the subject in the past. The reference to a song within a song expresses longing, not just for an old tune, but also for the memories it provokes. The words point to an apparent contradiction between being rough and ready guys and harmonizing, thus highlighting an ideal of normative masculinity called into question by the act of singing together. The song trades on this kind of sentimental masculinity, particularly when performed by a group of men like Miller's sing-along gang. According to Heart of My Heart, singing and harmonizing brings people closer together. It expresses a longing for the day in which this was a regular occurrence. So this general project fits in with a larger Cold War agenda. Herman Gray has argued that during the Cold War, the networks were adopting a discourse in which the power of the medium was thought to lie in its potential to plug each of us into the same events and viewing experience. Television would form the basis for a feeling, an experience of national identification and belonging. In Sing Along with Mitch, Miller understood television as well as song as media with the shared capacity to move people, and he appealed to song as an important facilitator and convener of sentiment, while the television itself offered access to a collective audience unprecedented in size. So one of the things that I'm thinking about with this material is the way that it is very much at this moment of significant singing along that is happening alongside the US Civil Rights Movement. And there's a very different kind of sentiment attached to this version of singing along on behalf of an all-male chorus. And so there's a certain version here of identification and belonging that is being constructed that we could, again, kind of critique as hegemonic and white and patriarchal. But the other thing that's really significant about Miller was that at this moment he also did some important work to highlight some very significant young African-American singers, and he received really significant pushback for doing so. So I've just got a couple of examples here of the extent of the participatory nature of this enterprise. Ballantine Beer was a sponsor of the Sing Along with Mitch show, so this was a pamphlet that would have been tucked into your six-pack of beer, and you would have got the lyrics alongside of it. They also produced and released a whole set of coasters that on one side have song lyrics printed on them so that you would have access to those while the show was airing on television. So again, lots of ideas about the possibilities of participation, the possibilities of singing along. The singer that Mitch Miller very kind of famously features and spotlights and really gets a lot of pushback. I ended up doing some archival research at the New York Public Library a number of years ago, and in the collection of Mitch Miller's papers, one of the things that I found were a huge file of letters that he received asking him not to have Leslie Uggams featured on the show because she was one of the very first stars, African-American stars on television. And there were postcards with Confederate flags and lots of really nasty racist stuff written on them. And he really was in a position at this moment to push back. He was so famous and so well established that he actually could make the decision, no, this was his call, he gets to feature who he wants to. And this was one of the singers that he chose to prominently feature from the beginning of that sing-along show. So I'm just going to jump quickly to my conclusion. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to bring this back to our present moment. Indeed, we are not done with sentimentality, and the continued popularity of sentimental song asks us to reconsider narratives about sentimentality's decline in status. And we might also ask, what is the political significance of these songs? The persistence of sentimental songs exemplifies a thread of sentimental masculinity that endures in Anglo-American popular song. Men as well as women sing sentimental songs, and men have played a considerable role in constructing the association between sentimentality and feminized domesticity. Davidson and Hatcher explain that gender does not entail intrinsic, universal, or necessary affective qualities such as sentiment. It is suspect to generalize about which behaviors, emotions, actions, or belief are synonymous with, or even characteristic of all women or all men, or for that matter, people of any gender. Chapman and Hendler write that the continuing lack of attention to male writers, artists, and philosophers' engagement with American sentimental culture suggests now, even now, a critical unwillingness to imagine the American man of sentiment, as if this subject position is too paradoxical, too unstable, too threatening to discuss. As if critics fear the results of deconstructing the alignments of reason, commerce, and the public sphere with men, and feelings domesticity in the private sphere with women. Indeed, to this day, the association predominates the scholarly and the popular imaginary. What are the consequences of relegating sentimentality and sentimental songs to a feminized domestic sphere? Much of the recent scholarship on masculinities emphasizes that American men have been disempowered by the feminizing effects of sentimental culture, that we would be better served by a culture that promotes and supports broad definitions of masculinity, including that of the sentimental man. So I'm thinking not only of R.W. O'Connell's ideas around hegemonic masculinity, but essays that Michael Kimmel writes about in a collection called Misframing Men. All too often, these narrow and confining definitions of masculinity are framed in musical terms. For instance, I have often heard my students say that they wouldn't want to be perceived as too Drake. But we have plenty of examples, particularly in song, of sentimental men opening up and expressing themselves, and of sentimental male listeners identifying with such expressions. In The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, Bell Hooks describes this as the feminist problem of patriarchal masculinity. Hooks writes, "Patriarchal culture really does not care if men are unhappy." She goes on, "By supporting patriarchal culture that socializes men to deny feelings, we doom them to live in states of emotional numbness. We construct a culture where male pain can have no voice, where male hurt cannot be named or healed. The kinds of emotional music excess that I have discussed today are not the kinds of excess that are usually mapped onto conceptions of American masculinity. Domination, power, expressions of violence and misogyny stand as far more familiar and recognizable forms of excess. By ignoring the expressions of sentimental men, we not only reinscribe the gendered patriarchal binaries of sentiment and logic, or emotion and reason, but we perpetuate these narrow definitions of masculinity. This is not to suggest that male emotional expression is straightforward or perfect. I am certainly not an apologist for the men's rights movement, and indeed, we do need to ask which men's emotional expressions are deemed valid under white imperialist supremacist patriarchy. However, I think we have to start at a place where we are willing to recognize and hear men's sentiment at all. So by writing men, sentimental men, and the many men that wrote, published, and sang these songs back into our histories of sentimental song and popular music more broadly, we can recognize that empathy and feeling are human traits, not just feminine ones. Thank you.
In the next episode, UW Lethbridge education professor Dr. Robin Bright asks an important question. Does reading even matter anymore?